Good morning and good afternoon, folks. I'm Vivek Mithil, from CEO of AFIDA Africa. Welcome to this inaugural and opening session of the Infrastructure Africa Summit virtual conference. I'm here with five very well experienced leaders of the private and the public sector active in African infrastructure, and we are here to talk about the Africa we want as a subset of Vision 2063. A little bit about AFIDA itself. We are a non-profit association of developers, funds, DFIs, and advisors active in private infra in Africa. Our 40 members account for about $45 billion of invested capital in African infrastructure. And along with advocacy and thought leadership, we are also pursuing the establishment of a catapult accelerator aimed at better learning networks for improving the scale, speed, and security of investment in African infrastructure. It is an honor to introduce my panelists. I'm joined by, in no particular order, Dr. Tuvela Nerenda Jerry, head of the Economic Integration Division at the Africa Union for Development Agency. Tuvela is an electrical engineer and development practitioner with more than 20 years of experience with working in the private sector, academia, and international development. She heads a division which spearheads flagship programs for implementing frameworks that advance regional integration and align with the aspirations of Africa Union's Agenda 2063. So right on topic. And is leading a team that are focusing on infrastructure development, digitization, cybersecurity, trade, and markets. Next, I'd like to introduce Maurice Radebe, head and director of WITS Business School. Prior to this role, he was executive VP at Sasol's global power business and managed its gas and liquids and gas to power business in the Middle East and Sub-Saharan Africa. In his 30-year career, he's also worked at Shell and Excel before this. Next, I'm delighted to introduce Sabine Dalomo, CEO of Siemens Southern Eastern Africa, or actually Sub-Saharan Africa, I believe. And in addition to her 30 years of breaking barriers at Siemens, she's also the deputy chairperson of NEPAD Business Foundation, has several advisory and board roles, including at the Deutsche, I hope I get this right, Welthungershilfe and honorary positions at German African Business Association and the Northwest University Faculty of Engineering. I hope I did justice to that. Then following her is Dr. Hafiz Ghanem, very recently, about a week ago, retired as regional VP of the World Bank and regional VP for Africa at the World Bank. He started his career as a young professional at the World Bank Group in 1983. And in that period has represented bank operations in over 20 countries. In the intervening period, he's also been, he's had stints, very meaningful stints at the FAO and the Brookings Institute. He's led action by the World Bank in inclusive growth, poverty reduction, private sector development, improving agri-yields in Africa, access to infrastructure, building resilience to climate change, and promoting regional integration. And finally, not the least, an old friend and business, business acquaintance of mine, Dr. Louis van Pletsen, who actually started his career way back, and he's actually quite young, so not too way back, at ESCOM, but since then, currently is the CEO and shareholder of Carbon CCS, a patented technology for removing CO2 from exhaust gas in power plants and ship engines. He's a director of SNC, an electric mobility and vehicle technology company. And he's also founder of IAIH Investment Group, investing in Africa and globally. So with that, I'm going to move on to the next phase and invite each of my panelists to share their views on where they are from their own perspective, where Africa is in achieving the Vision 2063. Before I do that, a little bit of introduction for those who are not familiar with Africa 2063. This was a vision and it's set a few decades back. There are 12 points to this vision. Half of them directly relate to infrastructure, particularly energy, transport, digital, and education. The 6 that relate to infrastructure include integrated high-speed network. That's number 1. Section 4 and 11 are about Pan-African e-university and virtual university, respectively. Number 7 is implementation of the Grand Inga Dam. Number 9 is single African air transport market. And number 12 is continental financial institution. Now, if you add health and water to this, that's the core of infrastructure services, which determine the level of resilience, prosperity, and progress of any society. So with that, may I invite Dr. Tuvela Narendra to kick us off with a little bit of a catch up on where we are in achieving Vision 2063. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Vivek, and good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to the participants joining, depending where you are, and also greeting and acknowledging my fellow panelists. So thank you, I think, in terms of just setting the context as far as 2063 and what it achieves, what it hopes to achieve. I think from our perspective, as the African Union's Development Agency, we are mandated in terms of leading and driving the various efforts that would contribute towards the attainment of Agenda 2063. And we are also, more importantly, in addition to implementation, responsible for monitoring and evaluating progress insofar as where we are with the agenda. So just recalling the fact that we have 7 aspirations, 20 goals, and 15 flagship projects and programs under the AU 2063. As AUD and NEPAD, we have been leading in terms of preparing annual reports, just taking stock of progress and where we are. We recently released and published in February of this year, the second report, just taking stock in terms of where we are as far as the implementation of the agenda. I think important also to mention that the agenda is a 50-year vision, and implementation has been broken down into 5 10-year implementation plans. So we are currently in the last 2 years of the first 10-year implementation plan, which will end in 2023, and then we will start the second 10-year implementation plan. So when we did the stock taking, insofar as where we are now, we find that we've made some progress, clearly, in terms of things, for instance, to do with regional integration. When you look at aspiration 2, which talks about an integrated continent that is politically united, and based on the ideals of Pan-Africanism, you find that continentally we have a score of about 84% in terms of the attainment of the targets to 2021 of that particular aspiration. And clearly, this is driven by 2 things. Number 1, it is the AFCFTA, which came into operationalization last year in January 2021. We started trading under the AFCFTA, so that has been a significant boost in terms of the aspirations for regional integration. We've seen that there's been quite a lot of work done as far as domesticating the AFCFTA across the continent. The second contributor to that has been what you rightly pointed out, is infrastructure development. There's been quite a surge in terms of development of infrastructure at national and regional levels that is contributing towards the interconnectivity of the continent. When we look at the other aspirations, you'll see that a close second, insofar as where we are with the targets, is on aspiration number 4, which talks about the peaceful and secure Africa. And again, I think this is also evidenced by the fact that we have been able to, across the continent, deal with quite a number of issues that have impacted on the peace and security of the continent. Of course, not to say that we have managed to deal with everything, but I think we're making good progress in terms of how we are actually working with our peace and security frameworks. And then I'll just mention the third one that is also, I think, a top scoring in terms of where we are with the agenda. And this has to do with the aspect of a people-driven continent, and also making sure that development is inclusive, that it includes the needs and the aspirations of women, youth, as well as the vulnerable. So you'll find that also on that particular aspiration, we have scored about 67% in terms of the 2021 targets. When you look at the other aspirations, they vary in terms of where we are, with the lowest scoring one being 37% on the very first aspiration that looks at inclusive growth and sustainable development. So clearly, I'm sure as we unpack the discussion today, we might also probe perhaps how we would better improve the scores in terms of that particular aspiration. As we look at the fact that we are nearing the end of the first 10-year implementation plan, we are making progress, but there is still quite a bit to be done. We will not hit all the targets in terms of the first 10-year implementation plan. And that again also spells the need, I think, for us to really think about what is it that we're going to do to make sure that as we prepare for the second 10-year implementation plan, we put in place the necessary measures that would help us to make better progress. So maybe let me leave it there for now, Vivek, and we can maybe talk a bit about the other details as we go along.
Fantastic introduction, and actually, right on cue. May I invite Morris, in your role as the head of the WITS Business School, in developing entrepreneurship, which is also part of this same agenda.
Great. Thank you very much, Vivek. Thank you very much, Stowella, for the wonderful overview of the 2063 agenda. And also I'd like to acknowledge our panelists and everyone who's viewing this broadcast. I'll just start speaking from my heart, having been in the energy industry for many years. Something that pains me so all the time is that the last time I still counted is that 600 million Africans do not have primary energy. That's an indictment to all of us who are leaders in energy, having spent 3 decades of my life in this space. And it means primary energy, heat and cooking. And this is a huge negative impact on any economy, because without energy, there's no economic development. But even more important is the fact that having now, being a parent, have 3 daughters, the biggest people who take the biggest pain because of lack of primary energy is women. Because women have got to wake up in the morning, go and collect wood, make fire for heating and cooking. And by that time, that young girl has lost opportunity to go to school. By default, then their talents and potential are short-circuited, and we lose human capital throughout the whole continent because women are busy just looking for primary energy. And that is very important. Our girls are not getting education, and all the consequences of gender-based violence and gender parity and inequality comes in. And so having said that, to me, there's a sense in which sometimes when we speak about Agenda 2063, we don't humanize it and bring it to that level of people who are actually being impacted. Now, if I were to talk about, as a business school, we have set up particularly an energy leadership center that is focusing on developing the talents that are required for energy. If I were to say what is the main objectives of Agenda 23 from the energy lens, is harnessing all African energy resource to ensure modern, efficient, reliable, cost-effective, renewable, environmental friendly to all African households, businesses, industry, and institutions through building national grids, regional energy pools, and making sure that the program for infrastructure development in Africa, especially in energy projects, kickstart, go, and move very, very fast. Not this start and stop that we have. One of the biggest, for instance, again, it's something that really makes me feel, oh, we're missing opportunities in the continent. We discovered resources in Mozambique, gas resources. That was 10 years ago. And we had a lot of hype around it. Even today, we've not even pulled one. We haven't exploited that resource. Instead, it's become a curse. We're starting to have wars around it. So that's very important. The question now is, what do we do in education We at the ALC, which is Africa Energy Leadership Center, which is based at Wits Business School, and it's also working throughout the main campus, supporting with our sustainability program. I believe a number of things. One, we need to build capacity through our formal postgraduate education. And we also, secondly, we need to develop a curated education program that is bespoke education program, and creating a lot of networking opportunities, which what we do regularly, and relevant and cutting edge research that really aims at tackling all the problems that we face in this area, thought leadership, and more importantly, influencing policy. It is very important to do that. What are the areas that I see continues to be growth? Obviously, oil now is under severe challenge because of the fact that it's a fossil fuels, and so the whole decarbonization issue is a big issue. But we've got a lot of oil in this continent, and then coal, I don't even want to talk about it because it's been now completely demonized around climate change. But again, we've got a lot of but I'm glad, actually, I read somewhere, and if I'm correct, gas and nuclear has been agreed by EU. Please correct me if I'm wrong, that these are considered as particularly gas as a transitional fuel going forward, and that will be a bridge from high carbon economy to low carbon economy. So it's a very solid bridge that will take us there. Renewable, solar, wind, very important that we need to focus on that. And then hydrogen economy. And I think we have abundance of all these three. And my biggest challenge now is that we're not actually localizing it here in Africa. Being in this space now, I see everyone flying in from all over the world, bringing the technology, exploiting it, and in that way. I can go on in terms of the programs that we give here. We give a master's program, we give a postdoc diploma in energy leadership, and we emphasize energy leadership. And we also specifically have a program which is electricity leadership, which covers energy value chains, and more importantly, energy sector governance, policy, and implementation. I will pause there and take questions going forward.
Thank you very much for that introduction. In fact, our AFIDA's catapult is geared towards exactly that. We'll talk about that later on. Next, Sabine, I'm delighted for your views from the private sector's perspective as to what has taken place in the last 10 years or 20 years in the African continent in the energy space that you're most proud of. Please.
Well, thank you so much, and it's a great pleasure to be on the panel with so many delighted panelists, and Vivek, you as the moderator. Looking backwards to what has happened, we see little movement actually within the energy, particularly say last 10 years, because I mean, besides South Africa, where the renewable energy has started in 2012 with the REAP program, the renewable IPP program in round 1, we have not managed to get much more than 5,000 megawatt in the last 10 years to the grid, and hence we currently have load shedding this year in 2022. We have the highest number of days electricity not being available, and Maurice already mentioned it. The devastating factor by having no electricity is an incredible knockdown for the ability of women to be active in society, be it studying as young girls, but also going to work because they are busy finding wood or other means in order to keep the household going. And I think here, we also have not seen that projects, particularly outside of South Africa, have made it to a bankable project. There are a few in Kenya with Lake Turkana. You have a few gas installations in Tanzania. But if you look at big countries like, for instance, Nigeria, they haven't really solved their power crisis. And the unbundling of the electricity utilities just has created more chaos for the network than one would have seen in the beginning. So when we look at energy, we don't see so much has happened, which the country or the continent actually needed. And Maurice also counted the 600 million which have access to electricity, and that number remained pretty stable of time. We do see, however, in the last 2 years, and I think this is one significant change where the COVID pandemic has also helped the Africans to understand that exactly the points which are outlined in Agenda 2063 are so essential for a unified continent, which is relying on each other. So rather than having, influence coming in from outside, having the continent working as a continent and all 54 countries having active exchange on an economic point of view, but also on many other aspects, be it on education, but also in, for instance, financial aspects as outlined in Agenda 63. But when we look at some of the countries, we see positive developments. For instance, in Egypt, which had a vision, they invested heavily into electricity, and they knew if you have electricity, you will be able to generate access to water, because water pumps also need electricity. And now they're also investing heavily into infrastructure, particular in the rail and the port network. And if you compare currently the development of Egypt within, the African set out, then you see quite a significant improvement and an attractiveness of that country to foreign direct investment. But when we look at some of the areas also from where the NEPAD Business Foundation is trying to support business, and for us, the NEPAD Business Foundation is an ideal amplifier, because one thing what we often see when private business is going into Africa, then governments are suspicious of private business, and it's very hard to get through some of the red tapes which are presented to you. And the NEPAD Business Foundation is their key pillars, which they are working on, helping private business exactly to cut through that red tape by being an in-between, a mediator, in order to open some of these bottlenecks. And these ones are particular in the energy space, but also if you look at transport, like for instance the North-South corridor, in order to make sure that commodities can be efficiently and cost-effectively brought to the respective harbor site to be shipped off or to be, used for production, because one of the shortcomings we obviously do have currently, mainly because of the lack of reliable and affordable energy, is that industrializing Africa is expensive, because you don't need only to set up your shop, you also need to bring water, you need to bring electricity, and these areas need to be managed properly. But when I focus back into where the developments happened, and in particular in the last 2 years, is that we see that African countries have focused on digitalization, because during COVID, people couldn't travel into the country, and they couldn't help you to get machines and industrial applications or energy resources back to the grid. So we had to do also largely all work digitally. And we see that particular countries like Ghana, Ivory Coast, South Africa, but also Kenya and Botswana have moved forward to use digital technology in order to manage electricity, but also water. And these are things which, if you would have asked me before COVID, how long would it take African countries to get to this level, I might have said, come back in 5 years or so. But we have seen specifically in the last 2 years of the pandemic and the impacts thereof, that Africa could leapfrog into a new time zone. And looking at the current geopolitical scenarios which are unfolding, in particular around, food supply, but also attractiveness of some of the resources. Maurice mentioned coal. 6 months ago, coal was a no-go. Since Germany has obviously a slight issue with their energy transition and the access of gas to be supplied to the network, coal is now acceptable again for interim time, and hence, African countries which have these resources are very attractive, and you see many of the political leaders traveling into Africa to exactly secure these deals. So we have a golden opportunity at this point in time as Africa to also set the scene for ourselves, to exactly live up to the values of the Agenda 2063, have this continental free trade agreement implemented by which, resources, food, but also other supplies are coming from within the continent to make sure that we are shielded against geopolitical impacts which are happening outside of our influence on the continent. And therefore, from an EPAD point of view, again, the most important pillars which we have put forward as our working areas are related to energy supply, to water supply, clean water for everybody, but also transportation, particular in the context of rail networks. And if I just give you an example of Siemens, I mean, you will know that we recently have closed a deal with Egypt on high-speed rail network, which Egypt is going to implement in the whole country. I think there are many opportunities which we can take on this part, and also, to share that knowledge gained for other countries on the continent. I hope that sets a little bit our agenda.
Fantastic. So necessity is the mother of invention really works in Africa as well. Excellent. Hafiz, may I invite you next to share your wisdom on your experience, and then gaps, challenges, and solutions you've seen towards implementing Vision 2063.
Thank you very much, Vivek. And Maurice and Sabine about energy and the need to make sure that every African is connected and has access to electricity. And so I think I will not dwell on that point. I just want to underline that this is a top priority in the infrastructure space, and that we need to think about how we can use new technologies, maybe green technologies, off-grid technologies, mini-grid technologies, to make sure that we have universal access to electricity on the continent. As Maurice said, you cannot transform African economies, you cannot create development if African people do not have access to energy, and especially to electricity. Actually, the World Bank did a study recently that showed that even when the connectivity is there, when the infrastructure is there, many people are not using it, and that the biggest constraint is the price and the cost. So we need to look at the competitiveness and the competition in the digital space to bring down the cost of access to the internet. The third area is the area of education, and providing people with the capacity and the tools to use the digital economy and the internet. And the fourth area is developing digital platforms. As Sabine mentioned, during COVID, we have discovered ways of using the internet, of using digital, and we need to develop more digital platforms. That is a lot to do with private sector, but also governments, e-government, e-procurement, doing taxation through the internet. These are ways of improving efficiency and improving governance. So using technology for that. So those are the four areas that in the digital space where we need to act. And I think that this is a huge opportunity for our continent. The second area that I wanted to underline in infrastructure is regional integration. I'm Egyptian. I grew up in Cairo in the 60s and 70s, and therefore, if you're an Egyptian growing up in Cairo of my age, you become a Pan-Africanist. I mean, our heroes in those days were Kwame Nkrumah, Kenneth Kaunda, Julius Nyerere. So I really believe in African economic integration, as a necessity. If you look at all of Africa, and if we integrate, it is a market of 1.3 billion people. That is just the size of India. So if we want to be able to be competitive at the world stage, we really need to integrate African economies. And that is why I'm very excited about the Continental Free Trade Agreement. But to make that Continental Free Trade Agreement work and to be a success, we need to improve the connectivity between African countries. It is often more difficult to transport goods or people from one African country to the other than to transport them to Europe. I actually did a study 20 years ago in Nigeria. And I found out that the cost of moving goods from London to Lagos was half as expensive as the cost of moving the same commodity from Lagos in the southern part of Nigeria to Maiduguri in the northern part of Nigeria. So that does not even involve going through borders. So that was just my point that I was actually closing off, Vivek, which is the point of the importance of investing in connectivity, in infrastructure linking, whether it is road, rail, or air transport, linking African countries together.
Thank you very much. Next, may I invite Louis from Pletson to share his views on where we are with Vision 26. And again, 2063 from the point of view of a private sector developer as to what's working and what's not working, and and feel free to boast about your great successes.
Thank you, Vivek, and thank you for having me. The Africa we want will be the Africa that we create. And I think if you want to say, if we want to have an example of how to do things, if we really want it, then we can just look back 24 months. The Western governments approved $9 trillion of fiscal support to address the COVID issue in 24 months. When they really had an issue and they wanted to do something about it, they literally printed more money since the Second World War. $9 trillion of incentives, $12 trillion of all-in stimulus. If you want to address the issue in Ukraine, they spend $1 billion a day. Today, by the time we go to bed, another $1 billion would have been spent. If you really want to address an issue, that's how they address an issue. If there's a gas shortage issue in Europe, I believe in the last month, 7 floating regas facilities has been installed in Europe. Approvals in a month. That otherwise would take what, 3 years, 4 years? So that we have to say to ourselves, are we serious to address these issues? And I'm not talking about whether the Western world is serious. I'm also asking whether the African governments are serious. And Africa 2063, of course, is a fantastic floor plan to lay out. But from an investor point of view, and for mobilizing domestic equity point of view, where are the opportunities? I mean, we can take every one of these aspects that the colleagues mentioned so far. Education, the level across Africa is substandard. As a result, the productivity is low. So are we going to solve this with conventional education? No, we're not. We have to put a lecture room in the hand of everybody with a mobile phone device. And we have to leapfrog the conventional education system if we want to reach 800 to 1 billion people in the time frame of this generation. We have 24% of the world's agriculture, although we import food into Africa. So we need to leapfrog the way we do it. We have an issue with land ownership. We know all these issues. The latest technology enables us to leapfrog. Electricity has been beaten to death. As long as I'm on these panels, the statistics remain the same. 2 out of 3 people in Africa do not have electricity. The development agents come and impose the rules and the regulations that they've invented themselves, and then cement those as a fact on how we get approval for projects. If you want to run an aluminium smelter or a stainless steel factory or a beneficiation plant, you know, the one thing we know for sure is the sun doesn't shine at night. So you aren't going to be able to do that on a solar system. If you want to develop your economy, you need baseload thermal power generation. And if you want to develop rural education very quickly, the solar application and the wind application is very applicable for people with no electricity. I mean, 800 million people do not have accommodation in Africa of a meaningful format. So are we going to build conventional houses, and how long will it take? Will it be people will it be the entrepreneur who come up with a house that you built in a factory and deliver it on the site so that we can roll out faster than we can do in the current position? Here on this call, all of us suffered from internet connection. How do we do that if we want to develop 1.4 billion people and we don't have a proper internet connection? Our environmental policies is stifling the pragmatic development because we look at project specific instead of holistic approach. Morris mentioned earlier a lady collecting firewood. So let's take that lady. How can she be productive if she has to spend 3 hours a day collecting firewood? How can she be productive if she has to cook indoors? What is the health benefit? 400,000 people per year, that's 1,000 people per day in Africa die because of indoor pollution. All of these are unbelievable unicorn business opportunities. If we free people up, the African population is probably one of the most entrepreneurial. Can you imagine a continent where roughly half of the 1.4 billion people do not have formal employment and they all survive? That is true entrepreneurship. That is buying an apple and selling it for a profit at the most basic level. It's an unbelievably entrepreneurial population. We need to free them up and let the domestic capital look after the domestic opportunities. And I will close to say, the solution, of course, is the mega projects will make the contribution. The high-speed train from Cairo to Cape Town, of course, will connect the continent. But in the first instance, we have 800,000 people today in Africa who walk to where they want to go, who have no means of transportation. So unless you give them micro-mobility so that they can be mobile in their own environment, so that they are educated through online and digital sources, so that they can do it where they are rather than to travel where they need to go, where they can feed themselves through a new venture of agricultural policies, and so that they can attract capital, including domestic capital. This will always be a discussion at policy level rather than implementation at ground level. Africa is the biggest opportunity for our remaining lifetimes as a young, growing population, increasingly impatient, and the break of the inward-focused ESG policy that moved from we all need to be concerned citizens to somebody else will tell us what rules we need to follow, I think has opened for us the opportunity to create, $100 billion unicorns in Africa within a short time span.
Fantastic views. And if I can just take a moment to consolidate everything that we've so far. We've got, we started with Tawela talking about some significant progress towards Vision 2063 in a few areas, and such as peace and implementation of the trade agreement and infrastructure development, but lagging in SDGs. Sabine added, necessity is the mother of invention. We've seen great leaps come together in digitization and health, which is all positive. Morris mentioned, amongst other things, the stop-start nature of development, which is quite key, actually. The one-offs and the once-in-a-while dynamics that we have in development. and the lack of onshore capability to deal with it, the dependence on international capability on the continent. Hafiz mentioned particularly digitization and regional integration from a transport point of view. And Louis, I mean, you've hit the ball into the net by mentioning big gaps that actually already exist. And without addressing some of these, we won't get forward very much. We've actually spent quite a lot of time over here. So I'm going to take a different tack to what I thought earlier. I'm going to give 3 words and choose 1 or 2, and let's have a rapid fire as to whether it's working, not working, and what can be done. So if you say scale, speed, and security of investment, if you take these 3 words, scale, speed, and security, let's start with Sabine. Take 1 or 2 of these words and give us your thoughts as to whether it's working, not working, what can be done better.
Well, I mean, look, from a skills point of view, it's definitely important that we help, first of all, to get the education system going so that people actually have a possibility to get to a kind of a matric level or beyond, and access of that is absolutely needed. From our point of view, I mean, obviously, as a company, we do support universities over the continent with, skills training, with digital expertise, but also with mentorship. Yeah, because one of the biggest challenges we have in Africa as well, because of the low level of industrialization, is that many people coming from a TVET college or from a university don't have practical skills, and so they're very hard to integrate into your workforce. So our story really is, and I think the call to more corporates to go into the same level is really mentoring young students, trainees, even from the colleges, to get them to a level that they understand how business is operating, largely because there is so little formal employment on the continent. When we talk about security, I see 2 aspects to security. One is for international investors, and also to take up investing into the African continent, but also for the local investors. You want to have a secure environment, be it from a political point of view, but also from a legislative point of view. You don't want then, when a new president comes in or a new party comes in, all the regulations with regards to, say, for instance, electricity regulation, water access, you name it, local content requirements are changing permanently, because it makes it difficult for you to assess a market and to commit yourself on behalf of your global investors. And when we look at, ESG specifically, which is coming more into the focus, these areas are absolutely vital, because none of the big corporates want to be associated with, countries. And that leads me to the second part is, stability and security, but also security when it comes to human rights, for instance, because we want to work in countries which value democratic values like ours, from our home country in Germany, and particular in South Africa. That's why South Africa is such an attractive location, because on record, a lot of these things are there because it's a free democracy. So therefore, these are the areas where I see we look for as business. And if we get skilled resources and we have security environment, investment is not an issue.
So on that note, very excellently put. In terms of political and legislative certainty, you're going to Ghana tomorrow, you said earlier in the call. Ghana is at the precipice of actually defaulting just for no good reason on about $2 billion of investment in its IPP sector, which will be a massive step backwards in the development of what has been painstakingly put forward in 10, 15 years. So please raise that with the people that you meet over there. If you get the opportunity. But Hafiz, if I may sort of probe again in the context of scale, speed, and security, you talked about cost of access of connectivity as an issue. That, to our assessment, has a lot to do with the repeatability, the creating a regular supply of deal flow, so that learning on how to put together infrastructure is there. Creating scale through regional integration, these two themes. But do you have a favorite between scale, speed, and security? Just take one word and please say what your views. How do we improve that in Africa? I think he's frozen. I'm sorry. Should we move on to Louis? Do you want to take that up, Louis? What is your how-to for any of scale, speed, and security?
Yeah. No, thank you. I can. I mean, I would say 1.4 billion people in the continent. Any aspect that you look at, there's 800 to 1 billion of those left behind. I mean, you can pick any topic: access to electricity, access to water, access to sewage, access to education. 500 million people don't have an ID document in Africa. I mean, you can pick any topic. There is 500 million to 1 billion people outside of that topic. And therefore, unless we think entirely different from how things have been done in the past, we will never catch up. We can only justify ourselves to leapfrog rather than to incrementally improve if we want to make any meaningful progress. If, Sabine, you're giving your contribution to the university to help, be aware that the biggest discussion is then whether the professor is entitled to a small Mercedes or a large Mercedes as part of his compensation at the university. You will need to take that money and allocate it so that it reach not tens of thousands, but hundreds of millions. Otherwise, it wouldn't make a contribution. I would say the African leadership, therefore, doesn't do themselves a favor. You mentioned yourself a default and a utility. I have large red scars on my knees going into the minister's office, begging for 0.5% increase on an electricity price tariff to make a project economical. And then you leave, and then the guy from the diesel engine factory, you know which one I'm talking about, come into the meeting room, and his tariff is 3 or 4 times yours, perfectly fine. So we need to also therefore leapfrog the political leadership. We can no longer be hamstrung. The young people in Africa, half of the 1.4 billion people in Africa is below the age of 25. These people are impatient, increasingly getting annoyed, and it's a pressure cooker where the lid will blow off soonish. And unless we come with these opportunities that will leapfrog literally everything we've done, we will not be able to scale. And I think the technology, and thank you, COVID, and thank you, Ukraine, has forced us to think very, very different in certain things, has forced us to also focus in our domestic markets. Each of these opportunities offer in the domestic market the ability to get the local economy going, because it doesn't help to have an interconnecting arrangement with a neighboring country if in the own domestic market you cannot stand on your feet. If you can't stand on your feet in the domestic market, it's unbelievably unlikely that you would be able to export to the neighboring country. And the ability to, lastly, to leapfrog also in the fundraising area. The funding for all of these need to be substantially changed. The development agents, whose role it is to be development agents, are run and organized and regulated by the Western governments who fund them with a set of rules that is suffocating the development in many of these projects. I've just explained that if you need a floating FSRU very quickly in Europe, you can do it in a month. I'm not talking about getting the permission in a month. The thing is there in place in a month. It's towed there already. It's producing. We haven't yet done the bird and the bat study and the fish study and the little frog study. It's there, it's producing. So unless, and that is where I think the stimulus has been unleashed also in Africa. And we should be very, very careful that as the economies reopen again and the world start traveling again, that we just don't go back to the old way of doing things, because that wouldn't enable us to leapfrog and look after 500,000 to $500 million to $1 billion people that need to be addressed really within a 3 to 5 year time span. Otherwise, the pressure cooker is going to blow its lid.
Thank you very much, Louis. Again, taking the theme of scale, speed, and security of investment in terms of, what Louis mentioned in terms of leapfrogging and making finance ready to meet that opportunity of leapfrogging as well. Would you give your views as what are the baby steps, ABC, that we should be thinking of in terms of scaling investment from your point of view? So Tavella first, please.
Thank you very much, Vivek. And it's a very interesting question, a very interesting discussion. And I do appreciate, I think, the provocative statements, I think, that are coming through from Louis, because I think he is spot on in terms of the fact that regardless of what we look at, there's still going to be a significant people that are marginalized. And the question is, how do we move beyond that marginalization of the $500 million to 800,000 people that still cannot get access to very basic services? I think maybe, to answer your question about scale, speed, and security of investments, I think we have to maybe agree, first of all, that whether we're talking about energy, water, transport, ICT, I think at the very core of the issues that we have is, one, it's about the access. Number two, it's about the availability. And number three, it's about the affordability. And I think to Louis' point, the whole question is, how do we crack that? How do we make sure that we're able to make all these different services available, affordable, and accessible to the majority, and if not to all of the continent's population? A number of things are happening, I think, in terms of, when we look at infrastructure development. I think Sabine talked about the North-South Rail and even the high-speed rail network. I think the premise that has been adopted by our heads of states in terms of how we approach development is that we have the major corridors that we have defined across the continent in terms of how we will achieve regional and continental connectivity. But I think beyond that, if you look in the last few years, there has been a deliberate move in terms of saying the corridors are good and they provide us with a broader connectivity, but how do we then reach the local person on the ground? So how do we make sure that those major arteries are actually linking to national development and also helping to connect people to the opportunities that are afforded and availed on the continent? So whether we're talking about the capacity to trade across borders, the capacity to industrialize and to produce goods and services, how do we make sure that local person at that very informal level is able to access those opportunities? And how do we make sure that the necessary infrastructure and services are reaching them? Now, I think part of what we see from where we sit in terms of some of the challenges is that sometimes there's a bit of a disconnect in terms of what's happening at the national level and what the aspirations are perhaps at the regional and continental level. And the question is always going to be, how do we bridge that gap? Louis has talked about leapfrogging, which I think we've talked about for years and years in terms of digitalization, and we're still talking about it in terms of whether we're talking about access to energy and so on. But I think we still maybe have a space to really talk about how. So we agree that we need to leapfrog, and the question is how? How are we going to do that? How are we going to make sure that the investments that are happening at the local, national level are really investments that are contributing to this broader, bigger aspiration of transforming our economies and creating jobs? And I'm specifically using the language of transforming economies and creating jobs, because when we look at the Agenda 2063 targets and the goals, that is one of the areas where we are lagging and really have a very big red flag in terms of performance. So we're not raising the GDPs of our economy significantly. We're not creating enough jobs and job opportunities for the young people, which Louis has also alluded to as sort of a pressure cooker that's bubbling. And we need to really, really think, how are we going to do this? How are we going to make sure that it happens? Investments are good, whether they're coming from the global or from within the continent, but the issue is always going to be making sure that those investments are being directed in the right way, that we are having the right policy and legal environments that are able to also hold our governments to account in terms of how those investments are being directed, how we're harmonizing standards across the continent to ensure that we're able to level the playing field for anybody who wants to invest, how we're managing to enable the domestic resources that are available to actually be utilized and put towards some of these continental imperatives. In some countries, you will see that there are restrictions in terms of how pension funds, for instance, can invest in mega scale infrastructure projects. And that's one of the things that AUD and NEPAD has been working on, is to see how do we unlock that? How do we make it possible for domestic resources to be directed towards mega scale infrastructure projects? A number of countries have done it. So we believe that if those countries can do it, it should be possible across the continent. And that would also help us in terms of perhaps not having this over-reliance on foreign funds and foreign development initiatives. The other thing I think lastly that I would want to mention is that we've talked a lot about how COVID perhaps has changed our perspectives in terms of being able to look inwards as far as solving some of our challenges. And the question is, how do we continue that? How do we, in a post-COVID world, continue to look inward before we look outward? We know that, of course, there are a number of initiatives that are coming from out of the continent that are significant in terms of what they will be able to do as far as infrastructure development is concerned, as far as regional integration is concerned. You know, you have the China Belt and Road Initiative, you have the G7 with their infrastructure initiative, you have the EU with the Global Gateway Initiative, all of which are aimed at helping, I suppose, in terms of the infrastructure development on the continent. But the enduring question will always be for us as Africans, how are we going to make sure that those opportunities are leveraged and maximized and matched with domestic resources to enable us to actually develop the continent?
Excellent. Thank you very much, Tawera. Hafiz, if I may ask you to pick up the other point, and actually Tawera referenced it as well, in terms of local capital, is it important in creating scale and speed and security of investment to make these investments attractive for the very people who use the infrastructure that we are talking about? Would it help to move away from the stranglehold that DFIs have on terms and conditions and the pace of progress to allow the pension funds and the banks on the continent to be participants in this?
Yeah, absolutely. I fully agree with what Tuwela said, that before looking at getting foreign money into Africa, we need to use our own resources, and we need to encourage our own investors. And that takes me, of the three words you mentioned, Vivek, I would like to focus on security and the importance of ensuring security for investment, and the whole concept and view of the riskiness of investment in Africa. I think that first of all, everybody today is looking at what is happening with debt levels, how debt is increasing, and now as we see interest rates rising, indebtedness will become more and more of a problem. So given the huge infrastructure gap and what we need, the level of investment that we need in Africa, it is very important that we attract private investment, whether African investment or foreign investment, because governments will not be able to cover all of the needs, and getting more and more in debt will be a problem. So we have to focus on making investments in Africa less risky, or at least the conception of risk to be reduced. I often argue with my friends, especially in the West, about their perception of the riskiness of investment in Africa. I believe that the perception of riskiness is much higher than the actual riskiness of investments in Africa. But on our side, as Africans, we need to, I think, at least on two levels. One, we need to put in place the legal regulatory frameworks that provide the security for the investors. And we need to make sure that we're taking the right decisions at the public level. Vivek, you mentioned Ghana, the IPPs in Ghana, and the problems there and the risk of the Ghanaians defaulting on some of those IPPs. And I happen to know the situation, and this really is a reflection of mistakes in planning that happened years back. When Ghana had a big deficit in energy, they just signed off on all of those IPPs, which are contracts where you have to pay for the electricity whether you use it or not. And now they are in a situation where there is an oversupply of electricity in Ghana, and the Ghanaians are in a situation where they're paying for electricity that they are not using and cannot use. So these are the kinds of things that we have on the continent. We need. When I say we have to look at the legal regulatory framework, we need to have the institutions that actually are able to regulate that are able to make the right decisions.
Good planning is actually something we haven't discussed, and we can keep on. I'm very conscious that we are actually well over our 1 hour slot over here, but I want to bring Maurice in for one last comment in terms of the education, growing entrepreneurs. Again, speed, scale, security. What is the role? What would you like to see happen in the next 1 or 2 years that sets us on a path?
Thank you very much, Vivek. A very fascinating discussion. In terms of skills, I think there's 2 aspects of skills which we have to focus on. One is just the basic skills of apprenticeship and artisans that make sure that our plants run reliably and available. And right now, that workforce is getting old and is retiring, and we do not have a good pipeline of young people taking over that skills. And there where needs to have a lot of focus on that. The second one is skills in terms of leadership. Leaders that understand that they're running a huge, complex enterprise here. And therefore, that's why here in our business education, we're talking about leaders understanding the energy value chains, from a value chain of oil and gas into electricity value chain, renewable energy value chain, hydrogen value chain, how to integrate those things because they are extremely complex, and in order to be able to make the impact. The second one is obviously the dynamic between energy and sustainability. Very important. Leaders need to understand that. But even more importantly, and Hafez has made this point, I want that we develop what we call not goalkeeper regulators who are there to stop you to score a goal, but developmental regulators who are like coach who's going to help us to score the goal. And that's a mindset that we need to change with our regulators, because they see themselves as gatekeepers instead of actually being there to coach and making sure that we score goals. That's why then the speed comes in. The speed of all energy projects is frustrated by regulations, bureaucracy, policy frameworks that were designed to stop people from actually bringing projects on board as quickly as possible, as Louis has said. So therefore, the speed is important. Another important thing that militates against the speed is downright corruption. Let's be open in Africa. Corruption is a major slower of development, and in fact, it steals from our people. And therefore, no projects happens because the money has been siphoned off. We must stop that, arrest them, put them in jail, and making sure that we have. The final one on security, let's stop these warlords. And these warlords are created by the old paradigm of actually discovering any energy resource, whether it's gas, and then from pit to port kind of framework that has dominated the colonial power. So you rule in Africa. Once you find something in a pit, you dig it, all the logistics are going to the port, whether it's the port that is an aeroplane or a port in the sea. And in between, you need a landlord that is going to make sure that you arm them with guns to protect that goods. And that landlord, that warlord is going to be now creating war. And that's where we need to be absolutely brutal when it comes to dealing with the warlords and in order to liberate our entrepreneurs. And then the final point is that let's liberate entrepreneurs. Liberate entrepreneurs to actually go. In fact, I've reached a stage in our country that, frankly speaking, and I'm saying this with humility because I have huge respect for Eskom and Andre in particular, but let's forget about Eskom. It's not going to solve our problem. Let's liberate entrepreneurs to generate at every corner, everywhere, especially with our 100 megawatt. What we don't need is Eskom. What we need is energy security, and you can achieve it through different means. Thank you very much.
Very much. Now, normally there's a lot of wonderful material here that I would use to summarize. We're also actually well past our 1 hour slot over here. So I'm going to have to stop here. But this group is something that I would appeal to you that we must keep talking and engage in the future. We probably need a day together. So on this summation,
create a WhatsApp group for us.
Yes, no, actually I would suggest that. So I'm going to call a close to this part of our discussion, the recording, and ask the organizers to step back in. But I do want about a couple of minutes with the rest of the group, if you're willing to share that, because hopefully some of the work that the Business NAPAD Foundation, that the NAPAD Business Foundation are doing and what we are doing can actually lead towards that. And Tavella is well aware of some of the work over there, but I just want to share that with you. Thank you to all my panelists. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your wisdom and your energy in contributing to this discussion. We are just scratching the surface over here. There's a lot to be done. Quite a lot has been achieved. A lot to be done. The future is actually rosy for Africa. There's this, the fact that we're discussing these problems and means that we will solve most of them, and hopefully in time. The speed is very important. So with that, I would say let's bring this call to a close and have a wonderful day ahead. Thank you very much.